It was the first time I had left the safety of my home station, and with that came a sense of fear. But more than anything, I felt shame. Shame for not telling Sukhoi the truth. I hoped he would be okay. The thought of him slowly realizing I was gone, hearing nothing, and going mad with grief made my guts twist. So as best I could, I buried those thoughts and hoped that Sukhoi could rediscover the strength I always saw in him. The caravan was in fact a single rail car loaded with crates of tea, and as I shuffled past boxes into my rusty little seat, I wondered about the trains of old. Large chrome cylinders that shot through the metro before the war. Sukhoi had told me that one could take you from one end of the metro to the other in only a day. Impossible. Looking over the rusty rail car, amazed that its crank still worked, I found the thought of trains to be akin to that of a unicorn. Some mythical thing from before my time. But whereas the unicorn could live a life in fiction, trains had one foot in reality. Some, not totally stripped, lay dead, their skeletons still clinging to their tracks. I don't think anyone had seen a working train in at least a decade. Artyon! I was shaken from my thoughts by Eugene sliding into the car, rifle slung.
So you applied for security detail too, huh? With badasses of our caliber, these traders won't even catch a cold, right?
He offered a joke, but I had to force a smile whilst trying to ignore it altogether. Catch a cold? Maybe Eugene was as nervous as I was. Maybe he was just trying to break the ice, as it were. But as I struggled with my shame, I did my best to ignore him. We were vaguely familiar, Eugene and I. As children growing up in exhibition, there were few others to play with. He was one of those snotty, mouth faster than his brain types, and it seemed that little had changed as he hit adulthood. But I was flawed in my own way too. I may not have been a talkative child, but it was Eugene's tall tales of the surface that convinced me to sneak away to the airlock, to the botanical gardens in the first place. As a child, I wished that I hadn't gone alone. It would have been better, perhaps, to have had Eugene with me. But now, I more than wished I hadn't gone at all. 2 more men, the traders, piled into the car, and Eugene made a similar joke to the one that he'd told me. And the eldest of the 2 forced a chuckle. The traders, an elderly man and a teenage boy, sat down, though my first impression of them was quickly cast as the old man smacked the younger aside the head and barked,
"No free rides, you'll have to pull the crank."
The young boy nodded and started on the metal thing, and with a metallic grinding screech, the car began to move, clacking its way to Riga. I covered my face as we left, and exhibition's lights grew farther and farther away. Eugene called out an echo and happily laughed, "Free at last!" Hours went by beneath the sound of the railcar's rattle, and eventually I looked to the traders more closely. Exhibition was an intimate community, a station where everyone knew everyone. But these 2... "So, where are you from?" I asked. The boy on the crank went to speak, but received a firm kick from the older man behind him.
"We're from Riga, just doing the rounds, getting merchandise."
"From Riga?" Eugene's ears perked. "So you 2 must have been to a few places."
"Exhibition, market, police, theater once or twice. Market is right by us back home, and the dramas that come out of there are interesting, to say the least. We used to go to Polis a lot more too, but nowadays that's a journey for stalkers and rangers, you know. No real chance unless you're from the Hansa. Hansa. They've got so many stations between Riga and Polis now. And if not Hansa, then it's the Rail Line or the Fourth Reich, or sometimes just bandits.
The younger trader on the crank wiped sweat from his forehead and finally managed to get out a meek, "If they're not fighting against everyone else, they're fighting with each other." The younger trader flinched, expecting another kick, but his older counterpart only watched him through narrow eyes.
"The service tunnel,"
the old one said. Clearly now we were all just trying to fill the noise void.
"You boys ever been down the service tunnel?"
I shook my head. "Why? What's the matter with it?" The old man shivered.
"Oh, nothing, I guess. It's just like any other tunnel, really, but a bit darker, I suppose. A bit colder. I came to exhibition by it a few weeks ago."
"Mutants on the line?" I asked, but the old trader only shrugged. "You know, I had a story about the line up past market once," Eugene started.
"Oh? And what story is that?"
The old man replied.
"My friend told it to me. He was working as a guard on a caravan just like this one, but their car was fatter, slower, you know. So he and his buddies had to walk along the tracks ahead of it, keep an eye out for bandits and stuff. Anyway, so they continued through the dark until my friend noticed this sound coming from the tunnel, getting louder and louder. The noise, which was borderline inaudible to begin with, had become on the border of audible sound and ultrasound, slowly growing from a point of imperceptibility, so you couldn't tell when you started hearing it. He says it reminded him of a whistling whisper more than anything, incomprehensible and inhuman.
I looked over to the others who were silent as they listened to Eugene. Even the younger one stopped grunting. "Inhuman?" I asked. Eugene nodded and continued.
So my friend starts to look around at his comrades, the traders, the other guards, looking to see if they could hear it too. But some wiped the sweat from their brow, and others looked nervously back into the dark from where they had come, their lantern's light barely reaching more than a handful of meters into the black. They heard nothing. My friend starts to get scared at that. The calm indifference of his group became more unsettling against the backdrop of the whispering. The whispering, which was getting louder and louder and still totally incomprehensible. He stopped, dead in his tracks, ear to the tunnel, and the rail car behind him had to stop so as to not run him over.
"What are you doing?"
his friends asked him. They asked him if he's tired or something, why he just stopped in the middle of the track, saying he should have told them sooner, etc., etc. But he just keeps listening and says,
"You don't hear that?"
His friends pale as they struggle to hear what only my friend could hear, the distant, echoing whisper. The traders stand up and yell at him, "What are you doing, T-Brain? Your batteries run out?" But my friend looks back at them, horror growing in his heart. "You don't hear anything at all," he says, and at that moment, a foul sensation crawled into his soul. Maybe there was no noise, and that was why no one else heard it. Eugene tapped his head with a greasy finger. Maybe he was just going mad. All the guards started to finger their rifles, standing motionless and tense, their ears too to the tunnel. The noise was right there now. My friend could hear it distinctly, and he kept looking to his friends, the traders, to see on their faces if they could hear it too. But gradually, their faces smooth out, as he is hit with a sense of shame, as he realizes that he has stopped the group for nothing, freaked them all out, over nothing.
"Hallucinations?"
I asked, admittedly being drawn into Eugene's story. Eugene grinned as he relished in his spot at the center of attention. He waggled his fingers like a conductor, and if he had one, he might have shone a torch beneath his chin for effect.
He starts to grow tense. "Fuck off," he says. "None of you hear it?" A friend of his takes his arm, tells him that it's alright, fear can get the best of anyone in the tunnels. Tells him to take a breath, rest on the rail car. So my friend turns around and goes to the rail car, earnestly trying to relax, to convince himself it was nothing. Tunnels can get the best of anyone after all, even stalkers. But disturbing thoughts filled his head, thoughts of pain, of madness. He thinks to himself, maybe if I stop thinking, I'll be okay. But in the absence of thought, the wet, lip-like sound of the whisper gets louder still. As the rail car moves again, he sees his friend walking ahead, rubbing his ear. "What are you doing?" my friend asks him. "My ears, they're itching. They're hurting," his buddy says. "And you don't hear anything?" my friend asked. "No, not a damn thing, but I feel pressure." The young trader raised a worried eyebrow. Pressure? He felt pressure. Eugene nodded and continued. The rail car moves onward, and for my friend, the sound filled the whole metro now. But still, it's only he who can hear it. And then he looks off ahead, sees where it is coming from, this thin pipe running along the roof of the tunnel. The sound appeared to be emanating from within it. It was some old communication thing once or something. Anyway, the muzzle was burst, and from the breach came the whisper. My friend's body turns back to the car and says, "Guys, we should stop. My head. I need to sit down." But before he can even take a step, he drops to the ground. Some of the traders were now rubbing their ears manically, complaining about pressure, and one of the other guards just kept walking along the tracks as though nothing had happened. My friend called after the guard, but it seemed as though he couldn't hear his shouts. One trader on the car fell into a heap and crawled into the fetal position, crying like a baby. My buddy freaks. He decides to run after the guard. Maybe he can get him to help save the others. The light of the car now behind him. He was in almost complete darkness when he reached the guard, who was still marching blind. My friend taps him on the shoulder, but nothing. So he gets in front of him and flashes his torch into his eyes. They were closed. And then suddenly, the guard frowned and broke his stride. My friend tried everything, slapping him, all of that, but he just stood there, frozen in the black. So he thinks, okay, no hope there, so he takes the guard's rifle and runs back to the car. Maybe he can help someone by himself. But most of them are already on the ground by now. The only noise coming from the trader, weeping in the fetal position. My friend approaches him and sees on his face an expression of such suffering that he stepped back, afraid he might catch it. It was so hot. They thought it'd be instant, but it was so painful. It burned so bad. My friend, not knowing what else to do, grabs the weeping trader and tries to pull him to his feet. "No!" the man cries. "They're so lonely, and their skin, they can still feel it burning." The man looks up at my body, tears streaming, his eyes now totally white. "They're so sad," he says. Eugene went quiet and allowed the image to sink into our minds.
"So?"
the old trader asked.
"Then what did your friend do?"
Eugene shrugged, but even I was enthralled now and demanded, "Well, Eugene?" He sighed and said finally, "What do you think?" He ran back to the station as fast as he could.
"And the caravan? His friends?"
but Eugene only shook his head. Stories were what helped stave off madness in the metro. Perhaps that was one human tradition that this hole didn't eradicate. People told stories around fires, fictions to forget reality for a while, to send your mind out beyond the trappings of the stone wall of the metro. But it was clear to everyone on the rail car that Eugene's story, though possibly exaggerated, was in some part rooted in reality. Ever since the first days underground, there have been stories from every station in the metro. Stories of what the more fanciful called ghosts. Were those stories true? Most would think so, though they'd never admit to it. The unreliable light of the lantern fixed to the rail car wandered like a pale yellow stain on the walls as they passed into the service tunnel. The light licked at the damp floor and disappeared completely if you tried to look into the distance, in front or behind. There was great darkness ahead, which greedily ate the light of my pocket flashlights from just 10 meters away. The wheels of the car squeaked with a whining, melancholic sound, grinding into nowhere. We were well beyond the safety of Exhibition's territory now, and with Eugene's story still fresh in my mind, I was doubly sure to stay on alert. The route from Exhibition to Riga was considered safe, especially given the positive relationship between those two stations. But this service tunnel the old trader had decided to take us through dispelled any feeling of safety. Danger couldn't just come from the north or south, the two directions of the tunnel, but it could also come from above us, from the air shafts, or off to the sides, behind the long closed doors to forgotten utility rooms, to forgotten exits. Danger waited below too, in the manholes left behind by the metro builders, neglected long ago back when the metro was just a means of transportation. In any of these places could hide things that could squeeze the mind of any man into that of irrational horror. I had heard of the mutants before. How could I not have? Stories from stalkers passing through Exhibition, or even tall tales from Eugene. On the surface, there were these giant flying horrors, they said. Things they called demons. Winged things that were known to circle the skies, to snatch up men in their claws before dropping them from great heights. There were also spiders with the faces of people, whose only weakness was light itself. And then, of course, there were those which I had heard the most of growing up. "Watchman!" Eugene cried as black beasts started pulling themselves up from the manholes on the track. A distant howl filled the tunnel, and swallowing my fear, I brought up my rifle and opened fire. Our rifles crackled into the darkness, our muzzle flashes revealing the large, furry, hound-like bodies of watchmen. The most common and most dangerous creatures to roam the surface now, pack animals, things that behaved like wild wolves but were the size of lions. "Motherfucker!" Eugene cried as he and I fired into the blanket of black ahead of us. "Are we hitting anything?" he asked, but I had to ignore him and said, "Doesn't matter. Keep firing. I'll cover our asses. They're going to try and get us from behind once we pass the manholes." "Fuck!" The younger trader was drenched in sweat as he cranked harder and harder, pushing the railcar faster. I barked at him to keep going and was about to pull the older trader out of the way so I could give cover fire to our rear, when a watchman crawled up from under the car and, in one movement, chomped down on the trader's head, taking off everything from the collarbone up in a single bite. The young trader screamed as blood sprayed over his face, and trying not to think about the life that I just saw get snuffed out, I pulled the body aside and unloaded directly into the watchman. Its body fell forward and slid off the side of the car. I winced as I heard its bones crunch beneath the wheels. "We're almost there, Artyon! I can see the lights of Riga!" Eugene said. But as I turned to him, a high-pitched ringing sound started to fill my head. I staggered and grabbed at my ear, Eugene's story fresh in my mind again. My body started to go weak. It was like my limbs were made of straw as I reached for Eugene's shoulder and mumbled for his help as he fired ahead. Though he was right, there was a light in the distance now, and I could just make out the guard postings of Riga. "What is it?" He turned to me, but as he did, I howled as I felt the bony claws of a watchman dig into my shoulder and toss me over its head back into the darkness. The world went white as I soared like a rag doll, and I winced, expecting to hit the ground. But instead, I opened my eyes to a world of whiteness. Flat on my back, I looked around helplessly until I saw it. Coming from the white fog that surrounded me, standing over me, a dark one. Its horrific face clear as it leaned down to meet my gaze. My heart thundered in my ears as I heard in the distance Hunter screaming, "Save Exhibition! Save the Metro!" Then suddenly I heard gunshots crack out, and the Dark One recoiled in pain, staggering back into the fog. I wheezed as I opened my eyes. The air punched out of my lungs and blood steadily weeping from my shoulder. I saw only darkness and tasted dirt in my mouth. Bullets whizzed over my head as I heard gunfire and yelling echo through the tunnel. The ground shook as watchmen ran by me for Riga's guns. I had to move. If I stayed still, I'd either be trampled to death or catch a stray bullet. Twice I tried to steady myself, but each time a watchman's taloned foot would slam me in the back and push me to the ground. Wincing and wheezing, I threw myself up a third time and began to run. "Don't shoot me!" I screamed as I ran directly into the line of fire, bullets passing my head by millimeters. Closer and closer the light of the guard post became, and I felt adrenaline pump through me as I heard watchmen close behind. "Don't fucking hit me!" I repeated. "Holy shit, Artyon!" Eugene, who had already made it in the car, called out to me, and closing the gap finally, I dove over the barricade as watchmen right on my ass were pumped full of holes. I sat back against the barricade, panting heavily, my skin burning as Eugene and a handful of guards mused as they mopped up the last of the mutants. "Holy crap, kid, that's some fucking luck right there." Words failing me, I gave only a weak thumbs up in reply. Eugene looked me over and winced. "Sukhoi is going to kill you when he sees this. You look like shit." Sukhoi, damn it. I couldn't think about him now. Eugene pulled me up and carried me into Riga. "Right, let's get you a medic and then some vodka." "Real vodka?" "Ha!" Eugene laughed as he helped me limp into my first stop on the way to Polis. G'day guys, I hope you enjoyed that story and thank you so much for giving it a listen. Remember, if you want some more scary stories, you can go to the Scary Stories for Late Nights playlist. Duskbowl has been a fantastic project to work on, and remember, if you've got any fanfic or fan art or any just questions about the series, feel free to email me at duskbowl.fm@gmail.com. I love every single one of you, and you've made being a microtuber probably one of the best experiences of my life. I want to give special thanks to my patrons, of course, being Lady Nevermore, Skulk Queen, Catherine Gordon, The Curator, and Stephen Stevens. If you see them in the comments, please say g'day. And to all of you, I bid you logs of love and shit shippers.